Thank you, everyone, for being here. I've been looking at the work of Diane Arbus for about 45 years now, I think. But Arthur knows a lot more about her than I do, so I expect to be corrected repeatedly as we have this conversation. To begin, I think, there are people here who, there must be some people here who don't know that much about her life, the path she followed. So maybe we can begin quickly with you, just recapitulating.
I'll give a very fast, or as fast as I can, biographical recapitulation. She was born in 1923 here in New York City. Her family was affluent. They owned a department store called Russik's. They were upper middle class Jewish people. They lived on Park Avenue. In the Depression, they had a come down, but the come down was Central Park West, the San Remo. And then they came back. They went back to, so they never really knew financial privation. When she was 13 years old, Diane, let me say one more thing about why it's Diane, because people always wonder, why are you saying Diane Arbus when I've always thought it was Diane Arbus? Her mother named her after the heroine of a Broadway play, a very sentimental play called Seventh Heaven that was set in Paris. And the heroine was a good girl, but she was poor, and she was forced into what seems to have been prostitution, but it's slightly kept vague. And she resists her rich relatives' entreaties, and she marries a poor man whom she loves. Well, Gertrude Nemerov, the mother, had done that against her parents' wishes, and Diane, when she was 13, against her parents' wishes, fell in love with Alan Arbus, who, just like her mother's beloved, was a penniless guy working at Russik's department store. After the war, the Arbuses, with the help of Diane's father, began a fashion photography business. They were both very interested in photography. Diane did the styling, came up with the concepts. Alan operated the view camera. They both hated it. Diane really hated it. Eventually, the book is long, and I'm trying to be short. She quit in 1956. I mean, I described that scene. Because there were only 3 people there, and the 2 other people spoke to me. She then went out on her own, and that's really the beginning of her career. There's going to be a show at the Met Breuer that goes from 56 to 62, and that is thought to be, even though she had taken photographs earlier, that's thought to be the outset of Arbus's photography career. Then, very briefly, because I think we'll talk about some of the pictures, and so we don't have to go into this too much. The one thing that you might not know, and is important to know, is that there was no art photography market, or virtually none, except for a few people like Ansel Adams. But for somebody like Arbus, you either worked in advertising or you worked editorially for magazines, and she did the latter because advertising was even worse than fashion. So a lot of her work was done on assignment, and in fact, there's a man named Peter Crookston who was her editor and lover, and he said he always thought of her as a journalist and never thought of her as an artist. And that's an interesting thing that we can maybe get back to. I think there is something there. So she started with the 35 millimeter work that other street photographers were doing. She did that from 56 to 62. In 62, she began shifting and completed the shift to a medium format camera, starting with a Rolleiflex. And so those are the square images that people who know Arbus's work are most familiar with. And I guess the only other things that we have to discuss now in terms of a timeline is that she continued working in that vein until her death in 1971, and that famously was a suicide. She lived her entire life in New York City, and she died actually at Westbeth, just a few blocks from here. Have I left anything out that you think is important that we know at this point?
What we can go right into is what characterizes her work, and you know, I think she's, as just about everybody knows, she's thought of as a portraitist.
Picture, an early
yeah,
picture,
why not
right?
start with that? Yeah, you know, it took her some time, I think, to find her way definitively to the making of what we would call portraits.
And this is an early 35 millimeter
photograph, and
circa 1960.
Right, and but ultimately she did go, you know, resolutely towards what we call portraiture. What does that mean? I mean, for your purposes, you know, what distinguishes a portrait from another kind of picture, and furthermore, what distinguishes hers from those of her you know, closest in spirit, August Sander, whoever else you might like, Lisette Modell, Ouija.
Right.
Right?
Right. I think the term portrait is very fuzzy. I think that this, I would call this a dual portrait, for instance, even though she never knew the names of these people. She never had any interaction with them. It tells you something about these people. It gives you an incredibly vivid picture of their relationship, at least as seen by Arbus. You know, there was a guy named Dan Kramer. I don't know if you know him. He's a photographer. He's best known for photographing Bob Dylan. But at the time, he was working for Alan Arbus. And Diane would bring in her film to be processed. And he said after seeing the pictures that she took at Coney Island, he didn't know what it meant to photograph anymore because the pictures were so expressive. I mean, he couldn't really explain why. He just felt that it's not that she was doing anything so interesting technically. So, in getting back to your question, a portrait is a funny thing. On the one hand, it is a portrait of somebody. So you might think, well, is this accurate about this couple? And we don't really know this couple, so we can't judge that. But I would say that painters' portraits, very similarly, you don't really judge whether Madame X, as portrayed by Sargent, was a libertine. I mean, I think she was a libertine, but you don't need to know that. You need to know that you're given a real and human and vivid depiction of, we're using portrait for human beings, of a human being that somehow is alive and somehow gives you some insight, whether it's accurate or not, into that person. That it has, you know, human interest actually is a good phrase for a portrait.
So if I were to say that I think an essential part of it is that it asks the person who's the subject of the picture, who are you? Who are you? Is that, you know, something that applies more narrowly to Diane?
The question is, I mean, you're talking about psychological portraiture. Right. And yes, she was certainly very psychologically minded. I would say that some of her portraits, most of her portraits, is that true? Anyway, many of her portraits do that, and some of her portraits don't. Some of her portraits capture people, actually, yeah, well, hold on. We'll go to the next one, and you can sort of see. So this is a very famous 1962 picture called Child with a Toy Hand Grenade. We can talk about this picture in that context. This boy's name was Colin Wood. He's now a grown-up who sells real estate in Glendale, California. But at the time, Diane recognized him in Central Park as somebody who had grown up like she, as a child, as a rich child. And she said he wore the archaic clothes of the rich. And in the other frames, he's clowning with her. And only in this frame does he seem really frustrated. So you might say, well, is this accurate about Colin Wood, right? I mean, is this, or is this a projection of Diane Arbus onto Colin Wood? And I don't know. It's another question.
Yeah.
Well, it's another question of how important that question is. But in this case, Colin Wood told me that, in fact, he was in a constant state of rage in these years, that he would bring cap guns to school and give them to another kid so that they would explode in the kid's hand. He would paint horrible, violent scenes because he was so angry that his father had moved out, that his mother wasn't paying attention to him, that he was being fed. He was living on junket, you know, on powdered sugar. So, and he thought now, he thinks, although he doesn't remember the taking of the picture, that Arbus recognized in him something that she felt in herself. That, for instance, he was expressing an anger that she felt but could not express so clearly. And you'll see that in the next picture, actually.
You know, actually,
Yeah.
let's go to the next because I want to
Okay.
ask you something about that.
Okay. Sure.
If it's the next. Yes, it is.
It is. The next. We figured this out, Leo. We had it all figured.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you know, of course, you look at this, it's, you know.
This is a mature, yeah, this is a, yeah.
This
yeah.
is from the high period of
Yeah.
Arbus's work.
Yeah.
And it demonstrates one of the things that, you know, to me at least, profoundly characterizes her work once she reached her maturity. Not every last picture, but an awful lot of it, which is a fascination with how people present themselves, a fascination with how they mask themselves, with the effort on her own part to pull the mask away, to be the fascination with how she's recognized by the subject to be doing that as she does it, the sense of an incomplete stripping away of the defenses of the person to get through to some kind of truth.
We have a disagreement on why this woman is angry. And just so you know, Leo thinks that she's angry because she somehow perceives that Arbus has discovered that her makeup is put on improperly and that her beautiful mask has been
Actually,
penetrated.
I don't
No?
perceive her as angry. Now,
okay.
my friend
dismayed,
Susan,
or-
whom I trust in most
dismayed.
things, insists she's angry. But,
And I think she's angry.
you know, to me, no, she's horrified, shocked to have been discovered, to have been found out.
But that's the point. She has not been
yeah.
discovered or found out because she hasn't seen this picture. And her presentation, as far as she's concerned, is effective. I mean, the thing about, and this is a whole, opens up, and we can talk about it later perhaps, a whole larger question of, Arbus said that she would prefer it if people didn't see the pictures she took of them. That as far as she was concerned, the image that you present to the world belongs to the world. It doesn't belong to you. And if you see it, and if she herself saw pictures taken of herself, they gave her the creeps. She said, "Ee," was her response. So I think this woman has no idea of what you're thinking about her and what very possibly Arbus was thinking about her. She is angry because Arbus got too close to her or her boyfriend had a fight with her. We don't know why she's angry. But I do think, too, that Arbus liked this picture because it expressed a kind of anger. And it was an anger that she herself, as a woman in the 50s and 60s, found it very difficult to express. It wasn't the way she was brought up. Boys expressed anger, not girls. But when she went to the Lower East Side and photographed these Puerto Rican women, they were very often angry. And that, I think, she really loved.
No. There's no right answer to it. It's a difference between what you bring to it and what I do, and
makes it interesting.
And that's part of the beauty of the photograph that it lets you do that. I mean, I look at this, and you know what I see is what I hear is that marvelous aphorism from Diane, which goes, people always end up showing you the thing they most wish to hide. And of course, what she's done here is she's dressed her mouth elaborately to be gorgeous, feminine, sexy, whatever. Except she's overdone it, right? I mean, the lipstick goes beyond the edges of her mouth, and that's the betrayal. That's the thing that gives her away. That's how I read it.
That's how you read it. Yeah. And anyway, we don't know.
Let's go on because we have lots to cover. We got so much to do tonight. And that's before we even get to questions, which should be good. So we've had before this two biographies of Arbus, one by Patricia Bosworth, another rather dubious one by Todd Schultz. A lot of people reacted, people who cared about Arbus and her work, reacted unhappily to the Bosworth book back in its day. I was one of those. And when I try to think about why I felt as I did, a lot of it had to do with the author's attitude, which seemed to me condescending, that she presented us with a version of Arbus that was endlessly neurotic, helpless, desperate, continually falling apart, perhaps managed to do good work, but did it on, purely by the intuitive seat of the pants, and so on and so forth, and constructed also a rather melodramatic and predictable narrative about suffering artist and inevitable death. One of the things that struck me immediately about your book is that you don't do those things, that you've treated her respectfully, that you begin from a position of genuinely valuing her work. We do have, I should mention, also the chronology that was produced with immense care and love by Dune Arbus, Diane's daughter, and which contains...
With Elizabeth Sussman of the Whitney.
With Elizabeth Sussman as well, and which contains excerpts from Diane's letters, diaries, project proposals, and so on, that say an enormous amount about her. But can you talk a little bit about what the biography brings to us that's new?
Sure. There's really only been one previous biography, the Bosworth one.
Count, yeah.
The Schultz one is it's called a psychobiography, and it's basically a whole series of categories and determining which ones Arbus fits into, and it's not.
So let's not.
It's not a biography.
But
the Bosworth one has a lot of, especially on Arbus's early life. Bosworth interviewed a lot of people who are now dead and came up with a lot of valuable information. I'd say the main difference, and from my perspective, the defect of that biography is that, as Patty Bosworth would tell you herself, she got interested in the subject because of the suicide. Her own father and brother had committed suicide. She was really interested in learning, in thinking about suicide. She originally was going to do it as a triptych. It was Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, and Diane Arbus. She started with Diane Arbus, and then she got so interested that she figured she would just stop there. So everything in the book, sadly, is leading up to the suicide. Everything is a harbinger of self-destruction. And I'd say the most, how to put it, the most deleterious after effect of that book, and I've got to say it's somewhat in keeping with the position, oddly, ironically, promulgated by the estate, was that this communion with the abject led to a fatal depression on the part of Arbus, that the work somehow depressed her. Now, Marvin Israel, who was very closely allied with the estate, argued against that, of course, and said that the opposite was true, that nothing made her more excited and happy than to be finding these people whom she would photograph. But I still think that those two ideas have meshed. And part of what I wanted this book to accomplish was to show that, as with many artists, the work is what kept her alive, even when she was suffering emotionally. So anyway, that's part. Part of it.
Well, so in fact, let's talk a bit more about biography itself as an enterprise here. In my mind, as I've said to you, good. In my mind, the lives of most artists are not terribly interesting. Mostly they're dedicated to their work. They lead fairly routinized existences unless they crash and burn in some spectacular way. There aren't that many Hemingways, and so on. There is an argument, too, that one should not write biography, that silence is better, that whatever you bring out about the life of the artist encumbers the work, gets between us and the work, prevents us from seeing the work truly, and so on and so forth. Conversely, it's also said that the justification for writing about the life of an artist is that it brings you to will help people to better understand the work. I'm not sure I fully agree with either of these, but I'd like it if we talked about that a little. And I want to add before that that of course Diane's life is interesting in its own right. It's simply a fact. It's it's an exceptional life in a lot of ways. The moment that you learn even a bit about it, it's very hard not to want to follow out the path of this, intensely engaged, extraordinarily alive person, who seemed to feel each moment right on her skin. And then, of course, there's another issue surrounding any biographical writing one does about her, which is, our own inevitable, lurid interest in her suicide, her very adventurous, erotic life, and so on. And yet, my feeling, in fact, even reading your book, is that luridness is brought more by us to her than it is inherent in her life. She's not a person of lurid spirit, not at all. What emerges from the chronology, from her own writings, a lot of which you quote, is somebody of noble spirit.
Yeah, I would say there are two. I mean, a person's life is a series of incidents, right? So it's, and artists often are just working inside their own studio or office, and so it's not very interesting. In her case, yes, as you say, a lot happened in her life, so there's that. But then I think more importantly, something about her fascinated people, and it's partly the way she expressed herself. She didn't talk that much usually, although she could talk a great deal if the spirit moved her.
With other people, you mean when
she was with people, she was often silent. Her brother Howard said that she would say very little, but when she said something, you really paid attention because it was much more original and interesting than what anybody else was saying. And she kept that up through much of her life, although she was also, if this doesn't contradict it, a kind of raconteur who could tell long and hilarious stories. And she often told stories about people like this family. And her friends would, when they saw the picture, although I'm not sure this picture because it is one of her greatest pictures, they would be disappointed in the picture because they had learned so much about the people that a picture could never contain that. We can talk about this later too, but she did say that a picture always has to be about, a photograph always has to be about something. And I think that's terrific, she said. And what it's about is always more interesting and complicated than what it is. But that aside, I think because people responded to her, and that's part of what is so interesting about this picture, because the three people, including the infant, who are capable of response are all responding to her. At the time they called him severely retarded boy. He can't. He's in his own cage, basically, a world of his own. But the others are all responding to Arbus. And John Sarkowski said to me back in 2003 that people were very interested in Diane, just as interested in them in her as she was in them. And I think that is one of the reasons why a biography of her is so interesting and important, to my view, because you see in a picture like this one, the people are responding in their own ways to the presence of Diane Arbus. And because you were in the position that she was in when she took the picture, they seem to be responding to you. And while this one is less shocking maybe than some, if you see a dwarf, for instance, who is looking at you lasciviously, as he was looking at her, it's discomforting. And so there is that element to it. I think also, because her sensibility, because she was able to express her sensibility in words,
you should mention how funny she was, by the way.
Yes, as brilliantly and as funnily as in photographs. And as, again, her husband Alan said to me, he thinks she was as great a writer as a photographer, which is arguably the case. And because, as Dune said to me, the key thing is that the same sensibility is in the photographs and in the writing, that then you begin to say, well, this is a complete artist. It's not part of what was intriguing to me is that because a camera is a mechanical device, people often, and because everyone takes pictures, people think that that a photograph is not an expression of an artist's sensibility, and no one disproved that statement more than Diane Arbus. In this picture, I don't know if it's worth talking about at all, but
well, there's
so much
plenty to say about it, but I was going to save it for a little later.
Let's wait till later.
Yeah. Let me ask you, though, Arthur, you told me when we talked a couple of weeks ago about this that I would have to wait to learn the answer.
Oh, what was the question?
Why you wrote this book?
Oh, this book, right. Well, you know, some of it is unanswerable, because in the same way that when Arbus was asked why she photographed this or that, she would say, I photograph what gnaws at me. There was something certainly about her that, that in the way that she recognized something in the people that she photographed, I think I recognized or imagined that I recognized something in her that I could relate to. And I found her, to me, she has this blackly comic view of the world, that the way she copes with the horrible things in the world is to laugh at them. And to laugh at them without losing a sense of empathy. And I liked that. And I felt that that was a sensibility that I understood and wanted to know more about that. And it seemed to me
Are you equally drawn to Beckett and Kafka?
Yeah. And to her. And so I think, and I guess equally, or maybe even more important, I felt that she'd been misunderstood. And I felt that people, as you were saying before, came down on one side or the other, that they felt that she was purely empathetic or purely finding the comic or the ridiculous in people. And I felt that because she was so good at doing both, because with this family, I mean, really, she did both, that was really interesting.
It's, this is a good moment maybe to remind everybody, especially, well, I don't know who here is too young to remember this, but you know, of course, when Arbus's work first became known, the reactions, many people reacted against it ferociously. These are direct quotations from the then eminent Susan Sontag, who, by the way, as recently as 10 years ago, I was told that her essay on Diane, as recently as 10 years ago, was still the most, by a very wide margin, the most widely assigned essay for reading to students of photography in art schools. She said, by the way, Lisette Model, you know, of course, judged that essay perfectly when she said, "This woman knows everything and understands nothing." But what was it that Sontag said? She said these were pictures of assorted monsters and borderline cases, that they are ugly people wearing grotesque and unflattering clothing. They're pariahs and miserable-looking people. They're alien, hopelessly isolated, immobilized, and mechanical, critical identities. They're pathetic, pitiable, and repulsive. That's all straight out of the New York Review of Books. There was, of course, a countervailing school which said she loved them all. She loved her people. They were dear to her. She was, a saint of sympathy in the old human condition sense. You want to talk about that?
Yes. The Susan Sontag thing was indeed very obtuse, and what she particularly said, because she was focusing on the pictures of sideshow freaks. We don't have any of them here, but they're among what Arbus is best known for. And she said that she's photographing people who are ugly, who don't know that they're ugly, which was absurd on the face of it, because these people were professional entertainers, and they used Arbus's pictures at a place like Hubert's Sideshow. You needed to post an 8x10 of yourself on the outside to help draw people in. So one of the ways she was able to get them to pose was that she would give them free 8x10 prints so that they had them to give to the... So that is just entirely ludicrous. However, she also photographed people that she called eccentrics. And the eccentrics didn't quite know their position in the world, and she would wade out to meet them, as she basically put it. And she said that the amazing thing was that they would crazify you a little bit when you talked to them, and the photograph was somehow a proof, after it all ended, that you were you and they were they, and there was this big gap. I think the ethical questions of her relationships with we don't have any of these pictures here, but there was a woman named the Bishop who called herself the Bishop Ethel Pradonzen, is a good case in point. There are also, she did a series of them for Harper's Bazaar in 1961, 6 of them. And I think she was troubled, actually, by the ethical gray area of it. She told that to certain people, and it's not, what I believe is that those people now are all dead, and the only reason we remember them is that they have been depicted by Diane Arbus. And the pictures, and some of them are great, live on in the way that portraits by painters of forgotten subjects live on. So I think that's
it's interesting. You mentioned before that Peter Crookston said that he actually thought of her throughout the time he knew her as a journalist and never as an artist. And yet she really operated at a moment when some of photography was undergoing a kind of transformation. What would you call it? Away from journalism and toward theater, literature, right? I think that if we go a little deeper with this, which I want to do because it's important, both the Sontag argument and the counter-argument to it say, essentially, what both of them do is they attribute value to photographs on the basis of the moral content they perceive there. And they understand that self-righteously in terms of how they see the photograph as honoring or dishonoring the actual person who was its subject, okay? But in fact, Arbus worked at a moment when people involved with photography were coming very powerfully to recognize that the photograph and the thing in the photograph were not the same thing, that in fact the photograph was a new fact, a new formulation. It was a statement, a rendering, discovery, a song, whatever you want to call it. And she was actually instrumental in this. She wasn't just carried along by it.
She was, but it's not happening in isolation, because also in journalism, the so-called new journalism was doing much the same thing. So it no longer was thought to be adequate for a journalist merely to report what was happening. It was necessary for the journalist to describe how those events impinged on his or her own sensibility.
So here's another one from Sontag, which is very revealing indeed. She said in her essay, quote, "What is most troubling in Arbus's photographs is not their subject, but the impression of the photographer's consciousness, the sense that what is presented is precisely a private vision," unquote. And yet, you know, for people like me, I mean, that's a large part of their beauty. It's not the thing that you deplore them for, it's the thing you celebrate them for.
But that, as we know, I mean, Arbus basically had her debut, if you will, at the Museum of Modern Art in 1967 in a show that she shared with Gary Winogrand and Lee Friedlander that was called New Documents. And the concept of the show was that, as John Zarkowski said, that the old form of documentary photography, which was a socially informed mission by people like Dorothea Lange, had run out of steam, and the pictures that were coming out in that tradition were boring. And so instead you had photographers who went out into the world and they recorded the world as they saw it, how it impinged on them and their impressions of it. And you know, that the other two did that as well, but she did it in a way that was startling to people. And a lot of people hated that shift. So a lot of the socially progressive people thought that this kind of inward turning and away from social movements was a bad thing, and some people still think that. So part of what she was being blamed for or criticized for was that photography and much of art at the time was turning away from, I mean, she was ahead of the game, really, but turning away from politics and turning towards personal expression. And the fact that photography was not really considered to be an equal art really comes out in those statements, because if it were, then the idea that it was too expressive, you would never say that a painter was too expressive.
No, you never would, or a writer or a filmmaker, never.
Yeah, so, but photography was still coming into its own. And I do say, and I think we agree on this, that Arbus was actually a leader. She was, among other things, the year after her death, the first photographer to be represented in the American Pavilion in Venice. She was the first photographer to be not only included in Artforum magazine, but on the cover of Artforum magazine. So she really, in my view, led the kind of charge over the ramparts into the bastion of art.
At the same time, and this is just me speaking now, and I don't know if you agree altogether or even at all with what I'm going to say, and it gets a little bit at perhaps what the limits of biography are in helping us to understand work. Seems to me that I never knew Diane, okay? So I'm putting words in her mouth too. But as I imagine her, she would have been one of the first people to agree with the notion that the work of art, the successful one, stands apart from the artist, is even perhaps a little bit mystifying to the artist. In fact, maybe that's even part of why it's interesting, because it's somewhat out of the artist's control, spiritually, let's say. I think that, you know, she would look, I'd like to believe that she would look at a picture like this one we've got here and see this extraordinary conundrum, which reads to me in a particular way, which is, you know, who caused this woman to look the way she does? You know, the tragedy of what happened with the kid? Or is it the other way around? Did she always look that way and make that kid the way he is? And that's a crazy, tragicomical question that sits there in the picture apart from her life. It's something that she came away with one day, right?
Yeah, let me tell you what I think she
Go ahead.
Said, because she spoke about this.
Yeah.
She spoke about this picture, and her view of it was. What's so amazing is that when she speaks about a picture, you can see exactly what is going on in the picture, which is part of the value of biography, I think. It's not the only way to see it, and I'm not saying your way is invalid, but I think It's the right way to see it.
Go ahead.
So this woman, whose name is or was, I could never find her, Marilyn Doria, was somebody that Deanne saw in the subway. And she immediately saw that this woman was modeling herself on Elizabeth Taylor. And she asked if she could photograph her. And the woman said yes, although she was clearly a little bit mistrustful because she gave her mother's phone number to call. When she made this appointment, she then saw what the family consisted of. There was another kid, too, who's not in this picture. She said several things, which I think you can see here. One is that thing which I think you mentioned, that it's as if they played truth, because they married very young. They married when they were like 17. She said it's as if they played the game of truth or consequences, and they have to live with the consequences forever. So there's that. But she also said that they were very close, the parents, in a painful sort of way. And to me, that is what you see in this picture. That the woman is in something of a world of her own. The man is looking in a very sweetly earnest way at Arbus. The infant is reaching for Arbus. The disabled child is in a complete cage of his own, and the child is a kind of glue because he is actually between the two parents, and he is connecting them in, as she would have said, did say, a very painful sort of way. And I think that is, well, that's how I read the picture, but I read it with her help. And I think she thought it was both very funny and very sad. You know, that I think she found the woman's, the woman is carrying a camera, actually. So she's a photographer herself. I mean, it's a Brownie camera.
By the way, let me just, painful and sad, and this photograph, for those of you who know the photograph by Gary Winogrand of the black and white couple with the two chimpanzees, I'm never able to dissociate that photograph from this one, and vice versa, yeah. They're made, what's the year of this? 67?
I think it's 67, I think.
Same year.
Yeah.
Same year.
67.
And also the year in which she wrote to Peter Crookston of this picture, right, that she thought that all families were creepy in a way.
Actually, but it's not this picture.
It's not this one, it's the other one. It's the next one, yeah.
It's the next
one. You want to go to the next one?
Yeah. Every time I have to look at this thing. Hold on. There we go. Yes, this picture.
There you go. These are the families.
Yeah. So, again, I have a whole chapter on this picture. And
tell us about this picture, because
about.
I know you're passionate about this one.
I do love this picture. So, once again, the way she worked, she would come across somebody, typically a woman, because she was a woman and she would approach another woman, and say that she would like to photograph that person. So this woman, whose name is June Tarnopol, what happened was that June was a friend of a woman named Jackie Sharesky, who had gone to Fieldston School with Deanne. So Jackie ran into Deanne at a Doubleday bookstore on Fifth Avenue. And then a day or two later, Jackie called June to say that Deanne would like to photograph her. There's more to it, but that's the important thing is that, so she comes out to this house in Purchase, New York. The man, the husband, Nat, was a R&B music producer, and a successful one. I mean, you don't see the house. I mean, that's a point I will make, but it's a nice house. What Deanne did was she had them pose on these lounge chairs, which she moved away from the swimming pool, because if the swimming pool had been in the picture, it would have been a kind of Life magazine picture of the affluent upper middle class in Westchester County, which is not what interested her at all. Instead, she exhausted them. What you're seeing in this picture is Nat Tarnopol saying, when is this woman going to leave the house? And June trying to imagine how she's going to have to deal with him later, because she's the one who invited this woman into the house. And the little boy in the background, that little inflatable pool is where he kept his pet ducks. And the ducks stayed in the bathtub in the maid's room at night, and then they came out during the day. And as Deanne said, she took many, many pictures. She was there from 11:30 till, this is in June, so until dusk, so 7 or 8 hours. And you should know she was ill at the time with hepatitis relapse, so it was, but the point is, she only got one picture. That she thought when she left that she had nothing, but she knew when she looked at the contact sheets that she had it and she didn't have to go back. That's why I think she knew what was there. And she had this amazing way of describing this picture, which is that she said, it's as if the parents are dreaming the child and the child is inventing them. So you have this, you know, what is in some sense an Oedipal triangle, because it is a triangle, and you have this extremely attractive mother and this angry father and this, and so she said, Diane, that it reminded her of her own family, which there were many reasons why it would, because the mother, June, was a clothes horse like Gertrude, and Nat was he was from Odessa, and so was, I mean.
The way you just described it, by the way, the picture is, to some degree, a descendant of the picture of the kid with the hand grenade, isn't it? That that it's that momentary reaction of the kid to the act to the event of being photographed.
No, this kid doesn't even know that she's there. He's not.
He doesn't.
The little kid, no. He's
no,
already
I don't
lost.
mean the kid. No, I mean the dad.
Oh, the dad.
Right? That, in other words, that in the context
his
of
Sunday is being ruined
life,
by this.
Suddenly they become metaphors. Suddenly they transcend the event itself.
And when we get to the last picture in this series, you'll see how more complicated they're getting, because the other one is what you would call a portrait, right? I mean, the one of Colin Wood, Child with a Toy Grenade, is a portrait of Colin Wood. This is not a portrait. This is, and this is outside of her control. This is the beginning of the last phase of her work, I argue. And these people are no longer, well, the two adults are definitely aware of her presence, but they're not reacting to her in that kind of face-to-face seductive way. They're reacting to her with despair and frustration. And the little boy is not reacting at all. And that's why only this one, you know, I've seen some of the other ones, they're just prosaic family shots. There's nothing to them. And this one is somehow, and this is actually an important point which I think the book makes and which I want to make now, is that it is about the Tarnopols. It is about their relationship, but it is also mythic in some way. And that's what she did in a way that no other photographer that I know did. In many, many pictures, she was able to give you something that is very specifically about individuals, and yet also rises to something archetypal, universal, and mythic.
Absolutely. I want to give you know, everybody plenty of time to ask questions. So let me, you know, just ask you one more thing here, and then invite people to talk themselves. I'm going to oversimplify inexcusably here, but time is short. So
and we'll go to the last.
And we'll go to the last. Yeah. You know, there are many themes in Arbus. There are many ways to follow the patterns of her thought and feeling out. But to me, one of the principal ones, one of the most important ones and most moving, is a certain sense of fatality, or of our fatedness, that I come up against in her work again and again. And she talked about this. She would speak of what she called the flaw in a person's presentation of himself or herself, the gap between intention and effect, which meant the gap between how you wanted people to see you and what they really saw. She would talk about how the self was inescapable. She has that beautiful postcard she wrote to Marvin Israel, where she said the people she saw on Madison Avenue on Sunday were odd and splendid as freaks, and nobody able to see himself, all of us victims of the special shape we come in. She said that people always end up showing you what they most want to hide, that you are what you are despite your efforts to be something else, that the photographer, too, is passive in some fundamental way. She said, I've never taken the picture I've intended to take. They're always better or worse. And it seems to me that this fascination of hers leads us in many wonderful directions. One of them is photography and uncontrol, the degree to which the photographer makes himself a kind of recipient of what nature throws up. It points us toward the fluidity and the fragility of the self. It points us to our own essential insignificance, I mean, on the profoundest level, and transience. It points us toward the weakening of American political power and world power at a certain moment, which led John Charkovsky to write that Arbus was, he thought, the emblematic artist of the sense of failure that came to Americans with the Vietnam War. It is, as you say, both a tragic and a comical sense. I often feel that the people who hated her work, Sontag prime among them, what they hated most was the fact that she was as willing as she was to give herself to the world, to allow it to roll all over her. But this is me I'm speaking of here. I mean, these are things I value intensely in her work. Can you tell us what, in a similarly simplistic way, you value most, you love most, find to be the emotional core of her work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard to. I'll say a few things, but they're not definitive.
After that, we'll answer some questions.
I feel that for me, the notion of fatalism is a blind alley. It has more to do with what you were quoting from earlier.
You don't need to address the fatalism, that thing,
right,
at all. By the way, Arthur, it's really right. What you know.
Oh, I see. Yeah. And the work, it goes on for a long enough period of time that it has different episodes and different chapters. Sure. But to me, what is amazing about it, I guess most of all, is the intelligence of it. There's a sense of looking for connections and associations that other people don't see. There's a kind of she said famously, actually, that when she would get very depressed, she would think sometimes that she would send some other good photographer out to photograph what she thought was worth photographing. But then she came to realize that she had a slight angle on things that nobody else had, and that she would, and nobody else could do what she did, which is certainly true. So I think what I find most, and we've touched on it before, is that these things are very complex to discuss in all ways. I mean, a picture like this, you can compare it to Goya if you want. That's one way to look at it. You can look at, because at this point she was doing very interesting things with lighting, so you can look at that. But the main thing is, and it's lyrical, and it has a formal composition, but you then wonder, well, what is she getting at? And what are we supposed to think of these people? And there are no simple answers to these questions, which is what is so interesting about her work. I think I can't think of another photographer of whom I can say that to this degree, that the work is, it leaves you, the more you look at it and the more you think about it, she said that's her most famous gnomic statement. A photograph is a secret about a secret. The more it tells you, the less you know. Well, that is a complicated statement that means that the photographer has especially in the kind of portraiture, getting back to portraiture that she was talking about earlier, has a relationship with the subject of the portrait. So that's a secret. And then you as the viewer look at that picture, and you and the picture are in a kind of confessional mode, and so that is a secret as well. So it's a secret about a secret. And I think in the end, that's what keeps me believing that she's a really important artist, that she had, she was very much of her time and place, which I think great artists are, and yet she was also, she was ahead of her time in many ways in the things that she was interested in, like the things you mentioned earlier, but she also, it's universal. And so something like this, it's an image that I think once you've seen it and once you've really studied it is unforgettable.
Do you feel of this picture in particular that whoever else they may be or may have been, that they are us? I do.
Well, I think they are very representative of the human condition. I guess I would go, that's how I would put it. And so in that sense, they are us.
So let's see what people would like to ask. I suppose if anyone wants to ask anything of either of us individually, say who you want to hear from.
Point.
Right.
I was wondering if you could talk about the switch to the 6/6 negative, because that seems to be when she sort of came into her own, and you can dissuade me of that notion if you wish. But then I want to talk, and would you like to hear about the square format and what that did for her, and then the physical act of working with a twin lens camera?
Yes, well, that's a good and a big question. I mean, I think for one thing, we didn't show you, we showed you only one, in that sense, unrepresentative 35 millimeter picture. What she was doing very often, unlike other street photographers, is calling attention to herself. So people were reacting to her in a way that is rare in Winogrand. It happens, but it's rare. It's rare in Robert Frank. So there's the medium format camera, because you look down and then look up, and then it gave her a much more collaborative, formally collaborative position with her subjects, like Colin Wood, the boy with the toy grenade. So she's talking to him at the same time that she's, or right before she photographs him. In terms of the format, I think it did do something quite, there's something very, I could call it iconic, I could call it, there's something very fixed and formal about a square image that is not true of either landscape or portrait, horizontal or vertical 35 millimeter portraits, I would say. And so once she was working, and it was not an easy transition. There was a period when she thought she had lost the ability to photograph. It was, and her teacher, Lizette Medell, said that was perfectly normal, and she should photograph with both cameras, which she did for a while, before she decided that she was giving up the 35 millimeter one. I think it does. The other thing, and then you have.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to add to that.
She was also, when she started with the Rolleiflex, she had a wide-angle lens. It wasn't a changeable lens. So there was a slight distortion in everything that she was doing. And that added something also to the picture. So that so all of those things, I think, do change the emotional valence as well as the formal qualities of the pictures.
Yeah, I would add to that I think that in that long interval between the moment when she dropped 35 millimeter and the moment when she began to do this work in the state hospitals, she radically simplified the work. There were a whole bunch of things that might have been the subjects of her pictures, that were the subjects of her pictures earlier on, that suddenly weren't. Gesture dropped out of it, events for the most part dropped out of it, setting to a large degree dropped out of it. It became, to a great degree, stripped down to the single event of her confrontation with the subject, played out in 100 different ways, 1,000 different ways. But that confrontation again and again and again as the source of all meaning. Once she got to this work, setting came into it again somewhat. Gesture came into it, physiognomy came into it to some extent again. But for a long time, those things were largely absent, that whole central high period.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I mean, I mostly agree with it. It's not entirely true.
I'm curious.
You have a mic there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know more about her manner during a photo session. If we were watching her at work, how would that woman strike us, first? And second, did she direct her subjects heavily in order to match her vision of them, or would she simply wait for the moment of truth to arrive?
Yeah. Well, these are the questions that biographical inquiry can answer, actually, in answer
well,
to what you're, to what you were asking before.
Other than what I've read in Arthur's book.
So her manner was extremely mild and self-effacing. She would give enormous amounts of attention to people who were not often used to getting that amount of attention. That was one technique, because these were techniques. If she was photographing, well, people that you know, like John Gruen and Jane Wilson, she would go to their apartment and she would not leave. So hours would go by. She didn't have the shot that she wanted, and she would stay. They would get exhausted. They would, like the Tornapoles, they would try to get her to leave, and she wouldn't. She would very sweetly say, "Oh, just a little more, John. Just it won't take long. Call the office and say you'll be in late." And he said it was this bizarre thing that he'd always thought of her as somebody who was so nice, and that now she was so she was almost being sadistic. So there's that. Now, in terms of whether she would direct
she also,
people,
I mean, at least the impression I have from what I've read is that she also was to some significant degree a cajoler and flatterer, and I think she even speaks about herself that way at one point. Isn't that right?
Yeah, there is a quote that. Well, she talks about it in different ways, but she says that she finds herself so ingratiating. She'll listen to herself and hear herself saying, "Ooh, that's so terrific," and that's so,
yeah.
and that she thinks, in one sense, she's horrified by hearing herself, and on the other hand, she can't help herself from being that way, and also adapting her personality according to whomever she's speaking with at that time. Instinctively, I mean, she talks about going to see Ozzie and Harriet Nelson and Ricky Nelson and his family and David Nelson and his family, all in the same day in LA, and they were all very different families, and she could sense herself, because it was happening in the same day, adjusting her personality to fit them. But the second part of your question is, she claimed that she never, she said something like, I don't adjust the people, I adjust myself to, it's slightly different than that. But the point is that she's not moving them, she's moving herself.
I don't adjust the subject,
yeah,
I adjust myself.
It's not quite that,
right?
though. It's close, but it's not quite that. It may not be the word adjust, but that's what she meant. Well, it's not really true. I mean, she would, when she photographed Blaze Starr, a famous stripper, she helped Blaze pick the clothes out of her wardrobe. She helped decide where Blaze would stand in her living room. It was not, with the Tornapoles, she had them move the lounge chairs away from the swimming pool. She helped June pick out her clothing. She started as a fashion photographer, and she found that also horrible, that she wanted to distance herself as clearly as she could from what she considered to be a phony enterprise. But in fact, she brought to this collaborative form of portraiture some of the things that she had learned as a fashion photographer.
Can you speak about the picture of the two girls in the raincoats and how it came to be removed from her Aperture book?
Yeah.
And were there other people that were unhappy with the way their portraits came out?
Right. Yes, that's very simple, actually. There was, for those of you who don't know, there was, after Arbus's suicide, which happened in 1971 in July, there was in November of 72 a posthumous retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art that was accompanied by an Aperture monograph that is one of the best-selling photography books ever. It's about 500,000 copies have sold. Two pictures were removed from the show, and one picture was removed from the monograph. We'll get to your picture in a second, but the other picture that was removed from the show was one of Viva. It's quite a famous picture, and it's at the Whitney now. The Whitney owns it. She has her head back and her eyes are rolled back, and it was published in New York Magazine, and it caused a huge stir and a pulling of a lot of advertising, and it's a whole story in itself. Viva, John Zarkowski told me, called the museum and said that, as he put it, if they didn't take the picture down, she would send her thugs to vandalize the place. So he may have exaggerated, but they didn't have to take that picture.
The way I heard it, by the way, was she would send her kid over with a can of spray paint.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. That may be. That's not how he told it to me, but that could be. Kid is now an actor.
Is that right?
Yeah, she's on. Yeah, she's a big deal. Gabby Hoffman. They could have left it up because she had signed a release, basically. It was done for New York Magazine. It ran in New York Magazine. It was legally, I think, invulnerable. The other picture was one of many that Arbus took without getting releases. I mean, she tried, but often they were in the park. And so these girls, they were sisters. Their father was outraged by the picture. There was no release. They were completely legally on safe ground, and so after that first edition, that picture was removed, and immediately the picture was withdrawn from the show. She did print her own photographs. She didn't develop the film. She didn't process the film until Alan, her husband, shut down his photo studio in 1969 and moved to California, and then she learned how to develop her own film, but she always printed her own film. In the big Revelations book that came out with the 2003 retrospective, Neil Selkirk, who's the only person who has printed Arbus's work since her death, said that she never dodged and burned, that never manipulated the printing process. But Alan Arbus told me that that was not true, and that he had told Neil after the book came out that that was not true, and that she did it rarely, but she did do it sometimes. But she liked the flaws in the pictures. There's a great picture of a, God, what is it called? It's a family, a nudist family. Two parents and the girl
beside the car on the ground.
Yeah, and there's a fin of a car on the right-hand side of the picture, and it's a great picture. And there's a flaw in the sky, and she told this guy who bought the picture, who was working at the Museum of Modern Art, that she could fix it very easily, but she liked the flaw, and she was not taking it out. And interestingly, the first edition of the Revelations book, apparently, apparently, they mistakenly fixed that flaw. And that's my edition. And when I talked to Jeffrey Frankel, our dealer, I said, Jeffrey, what's going on with that? And he said, in fact, the second printing corrected it and restored the flaw. So.
Shall we stop there?
I guess we can stop there.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you.